You'd think a quiet weekend at my cabin would mean peace and privacy. But in an HOA neighborhood, nothing stays simple. When a so-called Karen spotted me chatting with a friend in my own yard, she decided it was a full-blown emergency. Within minutes, she was dialing 911, and what started as a false report spiraled so far out of control that my own SWAT team had to intervene. The sun had barely risen over the quiet rows of cabins when the air shifted from calm to uneasy. I was in my yard with a close friend, enjoying the rare silence that the HOA rarely allowed to last. We weren't doing anything unusual, just sharing coffee, talking about life, and taking in the crisp morning breeze. But in neighborhoods like this, where prying eyes peeked from behind blinds and neighbors acted like watchdogs, even something as harmless as a casual conversation could spark suspicion. I noticed her before she noticed me. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of the HOA's so-called community standards. She stood at the edge of the street, clutching her phone like it was a weapon, her gaze fixed on us with that mix of judgment and curiosity that had become her signature. She wasn't the type to wave or smile. No, Karen's version of hospitality was documenting, whispering, and reporting. At first, I tried to ignore her, hoping she would eventually tire of her surveillance and retreat to her perfectly manicured yard. But instead, she lingered, pacing slightly, her phone screen glowing as her lips moved in a hurried whisper. My friend noticed, tilting their head toward her and asking if I knew what was going on. I already had a good idea. Karen had been waiting for something like this. The HOA had been on my case for months, ever since I dared to challenge one of their absurd new rules about outdoor furniture. They painted me as someone rebellious, uncooperative, even a threat to the harmony of the community. And Karen? She had become their eyes and ears. If the board needed something to twist into a violation, Karen delivered. I tried to remain calm, sipping my coffee, pretending not to notice. But her movements grew sharper, her gestures more frantic. I caught fragments of her voice drifting across the yard. Suspicious activity. Not sure who they are, possible trespassing. The words tightened around me like a vice. I wanted to shout across the yard that she was wrong, that I was standing on my own property, that the person next to me was a friend I'd known for years. But I knew better. Engaging her would only fuel her performance. She wasn't calling to resolve a situation. She was calling to create one. The worst part was the speed at which things escalated. Within minutes, I could see her posture change, the slight nod of her head confirming that someone on the other end was taking her seriously. She exaggerated her account, gesturing toward my cabin like it was the scene of a crime. I imagined the dispatcher on the other end, trying to sort fact from fiction, while Karen painted a picture that grew more dramatic with every word. And here I was, the supposed suspect, still holding a half-empty mug of coffee. My friend shifted uneasily, asking if we should go inside. I considered it, but part of me refused. Why should I hide in my own yard because someone couldn't mind their own business? Why should I give Karen the satisfaction of thinking she had intimidated me? Still, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. False reports had consequences, and in a world where authorities were trained to treat every call as potentially dangerous, her little performance could turn into something far more serious than she realized. Or maybe exactly what she intended. I thought back to the other times Karen had meddled. She'd complained about the placement of my trash cans, about the way I parked slightly over the faded HOA line, even about the music I played when I hosted a small barbecue. Each time, she escalated things with a phone call, acting as if the rules of the neighborhood were sacred law and I was a repeat offender. But never before had she involved 911. This was a new level, one that crossed a line between annoyance and danger. Standing there watching her, I felt the balance tip. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. She was a threat. And as the seconds stretched on, I realized I wasn't just fighting Karen's obsession with control. I was fighting the power she had gained by weaponizing a phone call. She looked back at me briefly, her lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk, as if she already knew the storm she had unleashed. The truth is, Karen's call wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest chapter in a long history of the HOA targeting me, and she was just their most eager foot soldier. From the moment I bought my cabin, The HOA board had treated me like I didn't belong, like I was some outsider who had slipped through the cracks of their carefully curated little community. At first, I thought it was just about the usual petty rules: lawn height, paint colors, driveway cleanliness. But the deeper I got into living here, the clearer it became that this wasn't about rules. It was about control, and I had become the one person who refused to bow to it. It started small, the kind of annoyances most people brush off. I got my first warning letter a few weeks after moving in, claiming that the chairs on my porch were not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. I laughed at the absurdity, thinking it had to be a joke, but they were dead serious. Then came a notice about my trash bins, accusing me of leaving them out too early. After that, a complaint that my outdoor light was too bright and disturbed the evening ambience. Each letter felt less like a reminder and more like a warning shot. The board meetings made it worse. Whenever I attended, I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to slip up. The president, a man who spoke like he was running a corporate empire instead of a cluster of cabins, made veiled comments about residents who don't respect community standards. And Karen? She was always there, sitting in the front row, nodding along, her smug smile practically begging for someone to challenge her. It was no secret she thrived on being their messenger. If there was something the board wanted enforced, she was the one sent to sniff it out. What stung most was the way they seemed determined to twist even the smallest details into violations. A guest's car parked in front of my cabin for too long suddenly became an unapproved long-term vehicle. A garden bed I'd planted for my mother's favorite flowers was deemed non-compliant landscaping. Every time I thought I had found a little peace, another letter would appear, printed in that same cold, formal tone, signed by the board as if it were a court summons. Over time, I realized it wasn't just about me breaking their rules. It was about me questioning them. The moment I stood up in a meeting and asked why certain regulations even existed, I could feel the shift. They didn't want someone who asked questions. They wanted obedience. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was a problem they wanted to solve, and Karen had made it her personal mission to help them solve it. Behind closed doors, I'd heard whispers from a few sympathetic neighbors. Some admitted that they thought the board was too strict, that the constant surveillance and nitpicking were suffocating. But when I asked why they didn't speak up, their answers were always the same. It wasn't worth it. People who challenged the HOA always ended up with more trouble than they started with. They had kids, families, peace to protect. They couldn't afford to be targeted the way I was. So, I became the lone voice against the machine, and with every stand I took, the board pushed harder. Karen, ever the loyal enforcer, started watching me more closely. I'd see her walking her dog suspiciously slow past my cabin, her phone angled just enough to snap a picture. She logged every minor detail, every unfamiliar car, every extra light left on. And each time, the board would review her findings and send me yet another notice. By the time she called 911 that morning, it wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable result of a campaign designed to wear me down. They couldn't fine me into silence, so they tried to intimidate me into submission. And with Karen playing watchdog, they had all the ammunition they needed. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was the HOA's weapon, and I was the target. The moment the 911 call was logged, the entire situation slipped out of my hands and into the unpredictable world of police dispatch. I didn't know the exact words Karen had chosen, but I could imagine them, carefully crafted to sound urgent, dramatic, and just vague enough to trigger alarm. Dispatchers don't have the luxury of ignoring calls that sound suspicious, no matter how flimsy the details may be. All it took was a few carefully chosen phrases from Karen: unknown individual, possible intruder, suspicious activity, and suddenly my quiet morning was being transmitted as a potential emergency. I could almost hear the conversation in my head. The dispatcher typing quickly, asking for descriptions, clarifying whether there were weapons involved. Karen, in her usual flair, would have delivered her version like a witness to a crime drama, her voice trembling just enough to convey fear while still laced with that self-righteous confidence she carried everywhere. She knew how to make herself sound credible. She knew the right tone to use, the right words to paint an ordinary morning as something threatening. What unsettled me most was the chain reaction that call would set off. Dispatchers have protocols. Once a situation is flagged as potentially dangerous, officers don't stroll in casually. They come prepared. And in today's world, prepared often means armed, alert, and ready for confrontation. It didn't matter that I was standing in my own yard with a friend, holding nothing but a coffee mug. On the other end of that call, we were already being shaped into suspects. My friend noticed the tension in my face and asked again if we should go inside. I hesitated, knowing that if we disappeared into the cabin, Karen would only spin that detail into more suspicion. They went inside quickly after seeing me, she'd say, her words painted with concern, as if she had just witnessed the beginning of something sinister. I stayed put, but my chest grew heavier with each passing minute. I knew once dispatch relayed her claims, the officers wouldn't be arriving to check in politely. They would be arriving to investigate what they'd been told could be a crime in progress. In neighborhoods like ours, dispatchers also factored in the HOA's reputation. It wasn't the first time calls had come from this community. I'd heard stories of other residents dialing in complaints that turned into tense encounters. Most times, the police arrived to find nothing out of the ordinary, but by then the damage was done. Officers didn't forget addresses. The more a location was flagged for suspicious activity, the more weight future calls carried. My address was already becoming one of those red-flagged places, thanks to the HOA's persistence and Karen's vigilance. I pictured the dispatcher, maybe glancing at a screen filled with call notes, marking down the address of my cabin, highlighting the possibility of trespassers. Protocol dictated they err on the side of caution. I could imagine them radioing nearby units, their voices firm as they relayed Karen's version. Suspicious persons reported in the yard of a cabin. Caller states possible trespassing. 2 individuals, requesting units to respond. There it was, the birth of a narrative that bore little resemblance to reality but would shape everything that came next. Standing there, I felt the weight of how powerless it all was. Karen's single call had set an entire system in motion, and nothing I said or did in that moment could stop it. I thought about how easily misunderstandings could spiral. A friendly chat over coffee had become a coded message on a dispatcher's screen, waiting to be interpreted by officers already on alert. And with each mile their vehicles closed in, the version of me that dispatch had painted, a possible intruder, a possible threat, hardened into reality in their minds. My friend, sensing my unease, grew quieter, scanning the street where Karen still lingered. She wasn't leaving. If anything, she seemed more energized, pacing now, gesturing with her free hand as though she were giving a live play-by-play of our every move. It was like she was feeding the narrative in real time, ensuring that dispatch remained convinced they had a real situation on their hands. The idea that she was out there, building a case against us with every word, made my skin crawl. I found myself rehearsing explanations in my head, imagining how I would greet the officers when they arrived, how I would prove that I wasn't trespassing on my own property, that I wasn't a threat, that I wasn't guilty of whatever story Karen had crafted. But a sinking feeling told me that explanations wouldn't matter much. By the time officers stepped onto the scene, they wouldn't just be listening. They would be reacting to the warning they'd been given. And all it took was one false move, one gesture misread, one word misunderstood, for everything to spin out of control. It didn't take long before the faint hum of engines broke the fragile stillness of the morning, a low sound that grew sharper and closer with each passing second. My chest tightened as I recognized the rhythm of vehicles approaching fast, the kind of deliberate arrival that didn't belong to a casual patrol. My friends set their coffee down, eyes widening as the unmistakable sight of tactical vehicles came into view. This wasn't just a couple of officers checking in. This was the SWAT team. The crunch of tires against the gravel echoed through the yard, heavy and final. Doors slammed open in unison, and in a matter of moments, the quiet of my cabin had transformed into the kind of scene you'd only expect to see on the evening news. Black uniforms, protective gear, weapons drawn but held low, voices barking crisp commands into radios. It all happened in a blur, but every detail burned into my mind. My friend froze, their body tense, unsure whether to stand or raise their hands. I could only think about how fast everything had escalated from a phone call dripping with exaggeration. Karen stood at the edge of her property, arms crossed, her face set in a mask of smug satisfaction. She wasn't worried, not for a second. She knew exactly what she had set in motion. She had wanted this. The presence of the SWAT team validated her story, gave her the stage she had been craving. She looked like someone who had just won a battle, not a neighbor who had just summoned an armed team to the yard of an innocent man. The leader of the unit stepped forward, eyes sharp, scanning the area with the kind of focus that comes only from experience. He gestured for us to remain still, his voice firm as he issued instructions. Hands visible. Don't make any sudden movements. I raised my hands slowly, trying to project calm, even though inside I felt the pounding of my own heart like a war drum. My friend followed suit, both of us locked in place as the officers spread out across the yard. It was surreal to watch the property I had worked so hard for suddenly transformed into a tactical zone. The porch I'd built by hand, the yard where I'd spent countless evenings in peace, the cabin that was supposed to be my sanctuary. All of it had become a backdrop to a scene built on lies. I wanted to scream that it was all a mistake, that Karen had twisted reality into this nightmare. But I knew better. In situations like this, words could be dangerous. Every sentence had to be measured, every gesture deliberate. I caught sight of Karen again, her lips curving into the faintest smile as she spoke with one of the officers who had broken off to question her. She pointed toward me and my friend, her head shaking as if she were recounting something shocking. From the distance, I couldn't hear her exact words, but I didn't need to. I already knew she was doubling down, feeding the fire with every breath, making sure that the suspicion didn't fade. The team moved methodically, some checking the perimeter of the yard, others scanning windows and doors as if expecting someone else to burst out at any second. Radios crackled with clipped updates, the tension in their voices making it clear they weren't treating this as a casual call. They were treating it as a serious threat. And the more I thought about how dispatch had worded Karen's report, the more I realized why they had responded this way. To them, we weren't two neighbors having coffee, we were potential intruders, maybe armed, maybe dangerous. I glanced at my friend, whose face was pale, their eyes darting between the officers and me, silently asking what we should do. I gave the smallest nod I could manage, a signal to stay calm, to wait, to let the officers take control. It was the only way to keep this from spiraling further. Still, my mind raced with every possible outcome. All it would take was one officer misreading a movement, one mistaken assumption, and this quiet morning could turn into something irreversible. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Commands echoed through the yard, boots crunched against the gravel, radios hissed with static and clipped words. I kept my breathing steady, my hands high, my voice silent. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, measuring, assessing, deciding whether I was a danger or just the victim of a neighbor's obsession. And in the corner of it all, Karen watched, calm and composed, as though she had orchestrated the entire scene for her own satisfaction. The tension didn't break once the officers lowered their weapons and confirmed we weren't carrying anything dangerous. If anything, it only deepened when the attention shifted from the yard to the real question. How had this all happened in the first place? The SWAT leader gave a nod, and a couple of officers peeled away to speak directly with Karen. I watched her straighten her posture like she had been waiting her whole life for this moment, eager to deliver her version of the truth. I could see her hands moving as she talked, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. Suspicious behavior. They weren't supposed to be here. I was concerned for my safety. Her tone dripped with false sincerity, like she was auditioning for the role of the terrified neighbor. She wasn't just reporting an event. She was crafting a narrative, one in which she was the hero who had bravely acted to protect the community. The officers listened, jotting down notes, nodding occasionally. From the way their brows furrowed, I could tell some of them were starting to question the validity of her story. But Karen kept pushing, leaning on the HOA's authority to back herself up. "We've had problems before," she insisted. "He doesn't follow the rules. We've had to file complaints more than once." I knew something wasn't right. That was the line that made my blood run hot. It wasn't enough for her to accuse me falsely that morning. She was dragging the weight of the entire HOA's campaign against me into the conversation. She was trying to frame me not just as a suspicious figure that day, but as a chronic troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who had brought this on himself. When one of the officers finally approached me, his expression was cautious, his tone measured. "Sir, we received a call about possible trespassing and suspicious activity. Can you explain what you're doing here this morning?" I took a slow breath, keeping my voice calm. "This is my cabin," I said evenly. "That's my friend. We were having coffee in the yard when my neighbor decided to call 911. I gestured toward Karen without lowering my hands too quickly, making sure every move was deliberate. The officer glanced back at Karen, then at me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the urgency of the call and the reality in front of him. He asked for identification, which I provided carefully, every motion exaggerated so it couldn't be misread. As he looked over the documents, my friend added softly, "We've been here all morning. Nothing illegal has happened." Still, the questions kept coming. Who was my friend? Why were they here? Did I have proof of ownership for the cabin? Did I know about the reports made against me by the HOA? Each question felt less like clarification and more like an attempt to justify the escalation that had already happened. I answered each one patiently, knowing that losing my temper would only give Karen more fuel. Meanwhile, Karen hovered nearby, interjecting whenever she could. "I've told them about this before," she insisted. "You need to understand the kind of behavior we've been dealing with." Her words cut like knives, not because they were true, but because they came with the weight of repetition. She didn't need proof. She only needed persistence. The more she spoke, the more she shaped the officer's perception of me. At one point, the SWAT leader cut her off sharply, telling her to let the officers do their job. I caught the flicker of annoyance in her eyes, but she masked it quickly, retreating a few steps with an air of false humility. Even then, I could feel her presence pressing down on me, her satisfaction that she had once again pulled the strings to put me in this position. When the officers finally confirmed my identification and verified that I was on my own property, I saw a shift in their stance. The rigid tension in their shoulders eased slightly, the clipped urgency in their voices softening. They hadn't found anything to justify Karen's claims, but the confrontation had already left its mark. The yard, the cabin, even my morning coffee. All of it now carried the residue of suspicion. And still, Karen wasn't finished. She muttered under her breath about safety concerns and community standards, loud enough for me to hear, making sure the officers would leave with her words lingering in their minds. I stood there, feeling the weight of the entire HOA pressing down through her, realizing that this wasn't just about that morning. It was about the ongoing battle between me and the board, one that had just been dragged into the most dangerous arena yet. After the last officer stepped back toward his vehicle and the SWAT team began clearing the area, the silence that followed was heavier than any noise they had brought with them. My friend let out a shaky breath, but I couldn't relax. The air still carried the tension of what had just unfolded, and I knew this wasn't the end. Karen hadn't just called 911 on a whim. She had forced a chain of events that would leave consequences long after the tactical gear and flashing lights were gone. The fallout began almost immediately. Neighbors who had kept their curtains drawn during the chaos started to appear, peeking out cautiously, whispering to each other as they pretended to check their yards or collect their mail. I could feel their eyes burning into me, their minds already forming opinions. Some looked concerned, others suspicious, and a few carried that familiar mix of curiosity and judgment that thrived in HOA communities. Word would spread faster than fire now, and by the end of the day, every household would have its own version of what had happened. Karen, of course, made sure she controlled the first version of the story. As the officers packed up, she walked briskly toward a small group of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. She spoke like she had just survived a dangerous ordeal, her hands gesturing dramatically, her head shaking at the close call. She painted herself as the vigilant neighbor who had acted bravely to protect everyone. twisting the narrative so completely that it left little room for doubt among those who wanted a simple explanation. By the time I returned to my porch, my phone buzzed with a message from the HOA board. It wasn't even subtle. They wanted an urgent meeting to discuss the incident at your residence this morning. I hadn't even had the chance to process what had just happened, and already they were preparing to put me on trial in their little courtroom of community rules. The tone of the message was cold and official, almost as if they had been waiting for this moment. Karen's report had given them exactly the leverage they needed. I knew what was coming. They would claim I had endangered the neighborhood, that my suspicious behavior had forced a police response, that my presence continued to disrupt the peace they so proudly advertised in their brochures. It didn't matter that I had been in my own yard, doing nothing more than enjoying coffee with a friend. What mattered was perception, and perception was a weapon they had already sharpened against me. My friend suggested we document everything, maybe even speak with the officers ourselves to clear the record, but I knew how these situations worked. The HOA didn't care about facts. They cared about control. And now, with Karen's 911 call fresh in everyone's mind, they had the perfect excuse to tighten their grip. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of the SWAT team flooding my yard, the weight of their commands, the way Karen had watched it all with quiet satisfaction. Sleep wouldn't come easy, not when I knew the HOA would twist the incident into evidence of my supposed instability. Already, I could imagine the whispers turning into official complaints, the board meetings filled with pointed remarks about maintaining safety and addressing ongoing concerns. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a single call. It was about the board finally getting the upper hand. They hadn't been able to fine me into silence or push me out through petty violations, but now they had a story they could hold over me. A story that made me the problem neighbor, the one who brought chaos to their perfect little community. Even as I sat there replaying everything in my mind, I could hear faint voices outside, neighbors still discussing what had happened. Their words carried the kind of caution people used when they were deciding whether to stand with someone or distance themselves completely. I already knew which way most of them would lean. No one wanted to risk becoming the HOA's next target. The fallout wasn't loud, but it was steady, like cracks forming in a foundation. Every look, every whisper, every message from the board was another reminder that my life in the cabin was no longer private. Karen's call had done more than bring the SWAT team to my yard. It had opened a door the HOA would keep pushing wider, determined to make sure I never forgot the cost of standing against them.